Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in Acts chapter 17, and we've kind of been stuck on verse 26. I'm going to move on, or at least I'm going to try to move on. But this is the verse that white Christian racists have used to justify their racism. Take a little time to talk about this, the history of the white Christian church and their racism, which the tentacles still stretch into the present day. And the reason why is because of the mindset and the heart. Now, how this manifests. Now, remember we talked about the entire history of America is racist. It was started in racist. That's why you had slavery. You can't get around that. In 1865, the bloodiest war fought on American soil was over slavery, to end slavery. That was followed by 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. Now, there's a lot of mess out there in terms of how people try to justify Republican versus Democrat. The point is, America was racist and lived that way. Okay? And even in the North, even though the laws, Jim Crow laws, were pretty much limited to the South. In other words, some of the northern states did not have Jim Crow laws, but they were racist. And blacks could not get ahead, not because of Jim Crow law, but because simply racist attitudes. Okay. And that came because of how America conditioned white people that black people were inferior. And that's the point. How this manifests today, when you see the cult now of Trump. Why did Trump get 77 million votes? Why do people support Trump? Especially the white people, okay? Why do they support Trump? And now, the lionization of Charlie Kirk. He's a saint. And in both cases, what they energize in people is the whiteness. So that's how it manifests today. That Charlie Kirk was the apologist. Trump is the symbol. You can say he's the king, he's the figurehead. Okay? And but Kirk was able to spread the propaganda, the white propaganda. And what you have today with Christians is they try to, well, you can't align with the racist part of Kirk, but you have to say he was a Christian. Oh, he showed Christian virtue. Okay. Now, but all of this goes back. All of this you have to kind of trace back to how America was founded. The mentality, the laws, the science, and most importantly, Christianity. And it all stems from several verses that they misuse. One of which, going back to Genesis, that God's will is segregation because he made the black man inferior. The curse of Ham, they call it. And then with this verse that we're studying here in Acts 17, verse 26, that the end of it was that he established the bounds. That they used that to say, well, see, this is why you had segregation. Which, if that's true, then they themselves have sinned against God by exceeding their bounds, European colonization, and here in America, who told Europeans, who said that God told Europeans to come colonize America? See? So then you just admitted that you are ungodly because you came and you took over the Indians. But the idea is that too, that they used this to try to justify that this was a godly thing, racism. That God wanted it this way. So let's kind of get into it. Because as I said, I did study it. I'm going to not try to linger on this. Because basically, let me just tell you, this really deserves a lot more treatment than in this platform here, this video. I gave you a couple of good examples if you wanted to read it. The late Dr. Fred Price, study on race, racism, and religion, where he had, I think the book is several volumes, but he spent over a year on his television program from his church in Los Angeles teaching on this very subject, and he breaks it down after an experience, a wake-up call that he experienced. And then Dr. Joy DeGruy, post-traumatic slave syndrome book. That book right there, I'm going to tell you, that book kind of really answers a lot of questions. Let me tell you, for example, and again, I'm trying to resist, not going to, but that book answers, among a lot of other things, when people say, well, how can you tie slavery 200 years ago, which they're disingenuous, by the way, but she wasn't 200 years ago, but okay, 200 years ago, to how black people act today. How can you say that the connection? And she tied it perfectly. Like I say, that the argument is disingenuous, but okay. Let's go back. What I'm going to do is now I'm going to go back to Paul's. I'm going to go back to Paul's when he starts his discourse here. And this is in verse 23. Let's go back to verse 23. No, verse 22. It says, then Paul stood up in the middle of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every aspect. For as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I found an altar on which was inscribed to the unknown God. Now, we kind of covered this, the Greeks, by the way, that were big on philosophy. Now, that philosophy in which we get today's apologetics. And he says, therefore, what you worship in ignorance, I proclaimed to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in shrines made by hands, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. So this is important because notice he established that, okay, we start with God. And he said, from one man, he has made every nationality to live over the whole earth. Now, this is the part that you see that the racists they don't talk about this. Because think about this. Now, you think about the phrase that Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, a racist slave owner, a vile racist slave owner, one of the founding fathers, that he wrote. And the reason why I say that, just in case he wrote a lot of other things about the inferiority of the Negro, even though he didn't mind sleeping with him, but I digress. But remember, he wrote the famous words that we hold these truths self-evident, that all men are endowed by the Creator. I think I'm paraphrasing, but all men are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights from the Creator. I know I just butchered that. But the fact that he wrote those words, okay, let me quote it right, just so I can get it right here. I hate that I didn't say these right. Here it is. Let me read it correctly here. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights." Then he says that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, he wrote this while owning over 600 slaves, while sleeping with one of the slaves, fathering children with one of the slaves. But I do, again, digress. Because he would go on to write some vile things about the inferiority of the Negro. That's why I said that. So he didn't believe this. Or I should say, he believed this as it pertained only to white people. Okay, so now, and this is the whole thing that racists then picked up on this in our nation. Christian churches. They quote these words, but then yet when it comes to this, notice God says here that from one man he has made every nationality to live on the face of the earth. I think the King James says from one blood. So all men are created equal. All men are created from that one blood that God created. And of course, Adam. All men come from Adam that God created. So all men are equal in God's eyes. It's only when you get down to certain men, and nowadays, what we call racism. But these people cannot know the true living God when you hold to any kind of prejudice. So there are people on the black side. For example, you have the black Hebrew Israelites that say that the black man is the Jew, that the black man is going to, they actually teach this, the black man is going to eventually enslave the white man. And they get that from Deuteronomy, a perversion of Deuteronomy. And the reason why they say this is because the black man was disobedient, so God punished them. But, God is going to raise up the black people, the real black Israelite, the real black Judah. And then they will enslave white people. So in a sense, these same Hebrew Israelites, they're for slavery. They just don't want the reverse, They hate that white men enslave black men, but remember, they hold to the promise that that black people are going to enslave white people, and then they revel in that. So then he says, so then all men, from one man he's made every nationality to live under the whole earth, and has determined their appointed times and boundaries where they live. Now again, so the Europeans certainly didn't have a problem violating this. Now watch this. This was not about racial segregation as they taught. But notice what he said, verse 27. He did this so that they might seek God, and perhaps that they might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So again, it's funny because they use it to say whites and blacks should be separate, except when you need white maids, except when you need white butlers and slaves and all that kind of stuff. But the idea is that, notice, you ought to be separate, okay? Even though the white men don't mind sleeping with the black women. But the reason, in the sense of when he says he appointed their times, was so that they may seek God. So then, not segregation, but the idea is the appointed boundaries is so that the individual nations, you could say races or ethnicities, would seek God. So that should be the end of when you want to preach this. Then you ask the question, how are the individual nations seeking God? That's what should be the fruit. But notice what he says right here, so that they might seek God, and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he is not very far from each one of us. Now, he goes on and says, for in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now, interesting that Paul sometimes would quote men to sort of augment his point. So when he says even your own poet says this, this is not in any way Paul subscribing to these very pagan poets. He just said, okay, here's a statement where they are right. Verse 29, being God's offspring, then, we shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold, silver, or stone, an image fashioned by human art or imagination. Now remember, the reason why he is writing this is because all of the statues he was seeing that he saw displayed with all of these pagan deities. And now he said, oh, here's one for the unknown God. And they just said, well, let's just throw one out. Let's just throw that out there, the unknown God, right? Verse 30, therefore, he says, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day in which he's going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he hath appointed. Now, notice this statement, God commands all men everywhere to repent. A lot of times when I come across these kinds of verses right here, there's so many other things I can go, like, let me just mention this. This verse destroys Calvinism, because Calvinism says God has already chose people to be saved, and that he's already chose people that's going to be doomed, eternally doomed. Well, yet here Paul is saying God commands all people everywhere to repent. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. But then he says, but he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day in which he's going to judge the world in righteousness. Now that statement there, because a lot of people accuse God, and I'm going to say that a lot of people accuse God disingenuously. In other words, they want to say that how can, if God is such a God of love, why is he sending people to hell? Well, let's go back right here. The question becomes, God commands you to repent. Have you repented? Now, if you haven't repented, then yeah, God is going to judge you in righteousness. They always seem to omit this part, that the reason why people are going to hell is because they haven't repented. And then he says, because God has set a day in which he's going to judge the world in righteousness by one man that he appointed. So the judgment is set. This is a part of the gospel. And the reason why, and despite anything else, when you look at all of the evils of the world and you say, well, what? Let's say even a Hitler, the main reason Hitler went to hell is not because of his acts. He went to hell because he didn't repent. Hitler went to hell because he didn't repent. Now, because he didn't repent, his sinful nature just increased and increased and increased, from bad to worse to evil to heinous. Okay? He says because he is going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he's appointed. And then he says he's provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Now, Paul is the apostle for this. Now, verse 32 says, but when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some began to ridicule him. Now, it's funny because now all of a sudden they're listening to him. And now when he says the resurrection, they laugh at it, right? They begin to ridicule him. But others said, we would like to hear from you again about this. Then Paul left their presence. However, some men joined him and believed, included Dionysius and Areopagite, of the Areopagite. And then he says, a woman named Demarius and others with him. Again, notice Paul always brings up the women in his travels and his ministries, that he reached women in his name. I say that because you don't see a lot of that when Jesus, for example, was traveling around Galilee. They were mentioned some, without a doubt. Mary Magdalene, with some of his faithful followers. In fact, of course, Mary Magdalene was one of the first persons he appeared to, was the first person, he actually appeared to after his resurrection. But like, for example, when you see that they mention that Jesus fed the 5,000, they were talking about men and then not women. We just see a little more women being mentioned here. But it's also interesting to see the reaction to the gospel. And then we can understand why that it's not about any kind of political affiliations, religious affiliations. People are just simply rejecting the gospel. And we see here's what God says: preach the gospel, okay? Preach the gospel. And then watch this: he that believes and is baptized will be saved. He that believes not will be condemned. And this is kind of what we see here. We see Paul preaching the gospel, and then some believing, and then others not believing. All right, guys, I made it through what I was so tempted. I wanted to get further into the idea of the racism in the Christian church. But anyway, all right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I will see you in the next study.